In the adult, oxygenated blood is sent from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and then out the aorta to arteries in the rest of the body. Blood then returns through veins to the right atrium and goes into the right ventricle, which pumps it to the lungs in order to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. In the fetus, the lungs are not mature enough to do that, so oxygenation happens in the placenta, and 4 key adaptations or structures make this possible. These are the umbilical veins and arteries in the umbilical cord, the ductus venosus, the foramen ovale, and the ductus arteriosus. So imagine you're an oxygen-rich red blood cell that has to get from the placenta to the fetal tissues. Blood from the placenta is highly oxygenated blood, so we'll make that red. From the placenta, blood heads through the umbilical vein, the first adaptation of fetal circulation, and it carries oxygenated blood toward the liver. When the umbilical vein reaches the liver, it dumps blood into the portal vein. The blood in the portal vein goes out to every lobule of the liver and becomes deoxygenated, so we'll color it blue, although in reality it's more of a really dark red color. This deoxygenated blood enters the hepatic vein, which then drains into the inferior vena cava, which is one of 2 enormous veins that carries deoxygenated blood from the lower half of the body to the right atrium. Now, from the umbilical vein, a vessel called the ductus venosus forms and connects to the inferior vena cava. This bypasses the liver circulation and represents the second adaptation of fetal circulation. From there, the red oxygenated blood from the placenta mixes with the blue deoxygenated blood from the lower body. So red and blue make purple. And that mixed purple blood is joined by the blood from the hepatic vein before it all flows into the right atrium. Meanwhile, deoxygenated blood from the upper body flows through the other huge vein, the superior vena cava, again into the right atrium. So ultimately, oxygenated blood from the placenta and deoxygenated blood from the entire fetal body all gets mixed up in the right atrium. Now, before birth, the fetus's lungs don't play a role in gas exchange, because there's no breathing in the womb. As a result, the tiny arteries, called arterioles of the lungs, are constantly in a low oxygen environment. Because of this, there's a process called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction that happens. And this is where there's vasoconstriction or narrowing of the pulmonary arteries due to the hypoxic or low oxygen conditions. In other words, the smooth muscle around all of the arterioles in the lungs squeeze down when they sense low oxygen levels. This leads to increased resistance to blood flow in the arterioles that makes the pulmonary artery have really high pressure. That high pressure causes the right ventricle and the right atrium to all remain at relatively high pressures as well. And this means the overall pressure on the right side of the heart is a lot higher than the pressure on the left side of the heart. Now, in the fetal heart, there's an opening between the atria called the foramen ovale, which is the third adaptation of the fetal circulation. The foramen ovale is an opening made by a tiny flap of heart tissue that acts like a one-way valve. That opening shunts or moves blood from the higher pressure right atrium to the relatively lower pressure left atrium. So most of the blood actually bypasses the right ventricle and lungs completely and goes straight over to the left atrium and left ventricle and then gets pumped out the aorta to the rest of the body. Only some of the blood from the right atrium goes down to the right ventricle and enters the pulmonary artery heading for the lungs. For the red blood cells in the high-pressure pulmonary artery, there's a small blood vessel connecting the pulmonary artery and the aorta called the ductus arteriosus, which is the 4th adaptation to fetal circulation. The ductus arteriosus shunts blood from the higher-pressure pulmonary artery to the relatively lower-pressure aorta. This opening is kept open in part by a chemical called prostaglandin that's made by the placenta during fetal development. The aorta then sends blood to the entire body through its various branches. Now, as the aorta goes down, it splits into the right and left common iliac arteries, and those both split into internal and external iliac arteries. Each of these internal iliac arteries give rise to an umbilical artery. These 2 umbilical arteries travel alongside the umbilical vein and bring deoxygenated blood back to the placenta, where it drops off carbon dioxide and picks up oxygen. The cycle repeats itself this way until birth. Now, at birth, everything changes. As soon as the baby is born, the baby starts to cry. air flows into the lungs for the first time, and it replaces the water that previously filled the alveoli. As oxygen levels in the lungs and the blood rise, the hypoxic vasoconstriction goes away, and the smooth muscles around the pulmonary arterioles relax. The pulmonary resistance falls, and so does the pressure in the pulmonary artery. Blood can now easily flow into the lungs, and all of a sudden the pressure on the right side of the heart is much lower than the pressure on the left side of the heart. The flap of tissue that forms the foramen ovale gets pushed in the opposite direction, and like a one-way valve, it does not allow blood to go from the left atrium to the right atrium. It basically shuts off the foramen ovale, and over time that tissue seals shut permanently, forming the fossa ovalis. All the blood in the right atrium now goes directly into the right ventricle, where it gets pumped into the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. The drop in pulmonary artery pressure also means that there's a temporary reversal in blood flow through the ductus arteriosus. Blood from the aorta now shunts into the pulmonary artery. This is only temporary though, because the higher oxygen levels in the blood cause the smooth muscles in the walls of the ductus arteriosus to constrict. After delivery, the placenta is separated from the baby, and that means that prostaglandin levels fall, which also contributes to the closing of the ductus arteriosus. Within a few hours after birth, the ductus arteriosus starts closing up. The vessel flattens out and eventually seals completely, forming the ligamentum arteriosum. Next, there are the two umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein, which are surrounded by a yellow, gooey substance called Wharton's jelly in the umbilical cord. When exposed to the cold world outside the womb, Wharton's jelly shrinks down and squeezes the umbilical blood vessels, causing them to wither. The smooth muscle in the walls of the umbilical arteries constricts and they flatten out like strands of pasta. Within a few months, the umbilical arteries are mostly gone, with just a central portion that stays functioning as the superior vesical arteries which supply blood to either side of the bladder. Meanwhile, the blood in the umbilical vein and the ductus venosus starts clotting up over a period of days, and the blood flow eventually stops. The remnants of the umbilical vein forms the round ligament of the liver, and the remnants of the ductus venosus forms the ligamentum venosum of the liver. Alright, as a quick recap. During development, the fetal circulatory system has 4 key adaptations. These are the foramen ovale, the ductus arteriosus, the umbilical arteries and vein, and the ductus venosus. Once the baby's born and takes a breath, though, lots of changes take place. The foramen ovale becomes the fossa ovalis. The ductus arteriosus becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. The umbilical arteries become the superior vesical arteries. The umbilical vein becomes the round ligament of the liver. And the ductus venosus becomes the ligamentum venosum.